For 7 years, Corporal David Lawson had served as one of the few black royal guards at Windsor Castle. He carried the traditions of the post with steady pride. One crisp autumn day he first heard the man's jeering voice. It felt like just another tourist fishing for a reaction, something David had faced many times during the ceremonial watch. But when the man stepped forward and slapped him across the face, a fire sparked inside David. The choice he made next would echo beyond the castle walls. It would stir the quiet life of Windsor and leave a mark no one saw coming. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The afternoon sun hung low over Windsor Castle as the ceremonial watch began. Corporal David Lawson, a black royal guard in his late 20s, stood firm at the north gate. He felt the cool breeze tugging at his red uniform and the weight of his bearskin hat resting on his head. David stayed still, his eyes fixed ahead. The chill of the day seeped into his bones, but he ignored it. He focused on his duty, keeping his breaths even to hold his stance. The ceremony moved forward around him, a display of order and history that always drew visitors. The guards marched in tight lines, their boots ringing against the stone courtyard. A small band played a steady tune, filling the air with a sense of grandeur. Tourists gathered near the castle walls, their cameras flashing and voices buzzing. The crowd was a mix of people, families with restless kids, couples posing for pictures, and travelers from distant places, all eager to see this piece of British heritage. Children giggled, pointing at the guards' bright uniforms. Adults watched in quiet amazement, impressed by the guards' ability to stand so steady in the wind and under constant eyes. David had trained himself to block out the noise. He let the chatter fade into the background, his mind locked on his role. He was there to uphold tradition, to stand as a living emblem of the castle's legacy. The autumn wind grew sharper as the ceremonial watch unfolded at Windsor Castle. Corporal David Lawson stood at his post by the north gate, feeling the cold bite through his red uniform. His bearskin hat sat heavy on his head, and a faint shiver ran down his spine. Despite the discomfort, David held his position, refusing to shift or stretch. He kept his breathing slow, using it to anchor his focus and maintain his calm under the day's brisk chill. The ceremony carried on around him, a grand show of precision and pride that drew eyes from every corner. The guards stepped in unison, their movements sharp against the castle's ancient stones. The band's music rose, a bold sound that lifted the scene into something timeless. A harsh voice cut through his thoughts, jarring him back to the moment. "Oi, you there, give us a wink, eh?" The words came from a man in the crowd, laced with a mocking edge. David's gaze stayed fixed ahead, his body rigid. It was Thomas Reed, a wiry tourist with a crooked grin, holding a selfie stick high. The man's jeer hung in the air, aimed straight at David. Years of practice steadied him. He kept his expression blank, his posture unchanged. Inside, a spark of annoyance flared, but he tamped it down. He drew a slow breath, letting it ground him against the sting of the words. Thomas Reed grew restless as Corporal David Lawson stood silent at Windsor Castle's north gate. The tourist's crooked grin faded, replaced by a scowl. He waved his selfie stick, his voice rising over the wind. "What's wrong with you? Too stiff to have fun?" The jab drew a few snickers from the crowd. David remained a statue, his eyes locked on the horizon. His training held firm, keeping his face still, despite the irritation simmering within. He focused on the rhythm of his breath, letting it steady him against the man's sharp words. Unfazed by the lack of reply, Thomas pressed harder. His tone turned bitter, carrying across the courtyard. "You lot are all the same. Robots, in fancy coats. Bet you don't even know what's happening out here." A handful of onlookers laughed, feeding his boldness. David felt the words strike deep, challenging his role, his purpose. They weren't just about the uniform, they questioned his right to wear it, his place among the guards. Anger pulsed through him, hot and quick, but he clenched his fists inside his gloves. He wouldn't let it show. He stood taller, his silence a wall against the rising taunts. Thomas Reed's voice grew louder at Windsor Castle's north gate, slicing through the autumn air. "Come on, loosen up," he shouted, jabbing his selfie stick toward Corporal David Lawson. "You're no fun. Might as well be a mannequin." His words dripped with scorn, and a few tourists chuckled, encouraging him. David held his ground, his face carved from stone. The wind tugged at his uniform, but he didn't waver. Inside, a storm brewed. He felt the weight of every eye on him, waiting for a crack, a flinch. He gripped his rifle tighter, the cold metal grounding him. Thomas didn't relent. He turned to the crowd, his grin sharp. "Look at this one. Thinks he's too grand to notice us. Probably doesn't even care." More laughter followed, though some onlookers frowned, shifting away. A woman in a blue coat muttered, "Leave him be. He's working." Thomas ignored her, stepping closer to the barrier. "What's it take to wake you up? A dance? A shout?" he taunted, his voice booming. David's chest tightened, the jeers piling up like stones. The chill of the day pressed harder and his hands grew damp inside his gloves. Still, he stood firm, a pillar against the rising chaos. Thomas Reed's taunts echoed louder across Windsor Castle's north gate, pulling eyes from every direction. "Hey, everyone check this statue," he yelled, waving his selfie stick like a flag. "Bet he's glued to the spot." A ripple of amusement spread through the tourists, though some hushed him, annoyed by the disruption. Corporal David Lawson stood unmoved, his posture rigid under the bearskin hat. The wind carried Thomas's words straight to him, each one a jab at his resolve. Tension coiled in his shoulders, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to give the man what he wanted. The noise caught the attention of a castle warden, Officer Hannah Miles. She stepped forward from her post near the wall, her uniform crisp and her expression stern. She approached Thomas with measured steps, her voice clear and firm. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and step back," she said, planting herself between him and the barrier. Thomas turned, his smirk faltering. "It's just a laugh," he shot back, shrugging. Hannah didn't budge. "You're disturbing the peace here. These guards have a duty, not a show for you." For a moment, Thomas hesitated, his shoulders slumping as the crowd quieted, watching the exchange unfold. Officer Hannah Miles's words seemed to settle the scene at Windsor Castle's north gate. Thomas Reed backed off, muttering under his breath as he lowered his selfie stick. The crowd eased, some turning away, others casting awkward glances. Corporal David Lawson felt a flicker of calm wash over him, though his face stayed blank. He couldn't show it, but Hannah's firm stance lifted a weight from his chest. It was a quiet nod to the respect he deserved, a sign not everyone saw him as a target. The wind rustled through the courtyard, and for a fleeting moment, peace returned. That calm shattered fast. Thomas spun back to the barrier, his voice rising again. "Hey, tall and quiet! You hiding under that hat?" he called, sharper than before. Laughter bubbled up from a few tourists nearby. Beside him stood his younger cousin, Ethan, a lanky 12-year-old with a curious frown. The boy tugged at Thomas's jacket, his voice small. "Why's he so still, Tom? Doesn't he get bored?" Thomas snorted, brushing him off. "Because he's a wind-up toy, Ethan. No brain, just stands there." David heard every word, the fresh taunts digging in. His jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, rooted to his duty. Ethan's wide eyes stayed on Corporal David Lawson as the wind swirled around Windsor Castle's north gate. He pulled at Thomas Reed's sleeve again, his voice soft with wonder. "Why's his hat so tall? Doesn't it fall off?" Thomas rolled his eyes, his patience thinning. "It's for the tourists, kid. Makes him look silly," he snapped, loud enough for others to hear. A few in the crowd smirked, but Ethan kept staring, puzzled. "He doesn't look silly, he looks strong," the boy said, tilting his head. David caught the words, a faint warmth cutting through the cold tension inside him. Thomas huffed, turning to Ethan with a sly grin. "Strong? Nah, he's a pushover. Watch this." He fished a small coin from his pocket and flicked it toward David. The coin clinked against the stone near David's feet, rolling to a stop. Ethan gasped, stepping back. "Tom, don't." "He's not moving anyway," Thomas laughed, egging him on. "Go on, toss one yourself. Bet he won't even blink. These guards are all show." "Prove it!" David's pulse quickened, the small act stirring a deep unease. He held his stance, but the challenge hung heavy, testing his steel resolve. The scene at Windsor Castle's north gate grew chaotic as Ethan hesitated, clutching a coin in his hand. Thomas Reed's voice boomed, urging him on. "Throw it, Ethan! Show him up!" Reluctantly, the boy flicked the coin, watching it bounce off David's boot. A murmur ran through the crowd, some frowning, others craning to see. Corporal David Lawson stood firm, his face a mask of discipline. Inside, the small strikes fueled a quiet fury. Years of standing tall, now reduced to this game. The wind carried the tension higher, rustling the leaves around him. A local woman in a gray scarf stepped forward, her tone sharp. "Stop that, both of you. He's doing his job." Thomas waved her off, but the crowd split. Some nodded at her words, others egged Thomas on. The clamor swelled, voices clashing. From the castle side, Captain Laura Bennett, David's superior, approached with a brisk stride. She'd been checking posts when the noise reached her. "What's happening here, Corporal?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. David kept his eyes ahead, answering evenly. "No issue, ma'am, just visitors." The lie weighed on him, though. Trouble was brewing, and he felt it deep in his bones. Officer Hannah Miles returned to the north gate of Windsor Castle, her eyes narrowing at the rising noise. She marched toward Thomas Reed, her voice cutting through the wind. "Sir, I warned you before. This stops now. Or you're out." Thomas smirked, tossing his selfie stick between his hands. "We're just playing. Chill out." Hannah stood tall, unmoved. "Play somewhere else. You're crossing a line." She glanced at Ethan, softening slightly. "You too, lad. Keep those coins in your pocket, or there'll be trouble." Thomas scoffed but stepped back, dragging Ethan with him. Corporal David Lawson watched it unfold, his stance unbroken. Relief flickered inside him as Hannah took charge, but it faded fast. The day's chill deepened, and doubts crept in. Did this uniform mean strength, as he'd always believed? Or was it just a costume for others to mock? The question gnawed at him, heavy and unanswered. He'd joined to defend a legacy, to show he belonged. Now standing there, he wondered if that legacy cared about him. The ceremony droned on, the band's tune faint in his ears, but his mind wrestled with the weight of it all. A brief hush fell over Windsor Castle's north gate as the crowd's energy dipped. Ethan tugged at Thomas Reed's sleeve, his voice low and whiny. "Tom, I'm freezing out here. Can we leave?" The boy rubbed his arms, his breath puffing in the chilly air. Thomas sighed, his irritation clear. "Fine, you're such a drag," he grumbled, then turned his gaze back to Corporal David Lawson. His tone sharpened, loud enough to carry. "This one's no thrill anyway, just a dull post holder." He pointed down the line. "Those guards over there, they've got the real spark." David heard every word, his chest tightening, the jabs stung, questioning his worth among his peers. He kept his eyes locked forward, the wind brushing his face, but inside a quiet resolve hardened. He wouldn't let Thomas's words shake him. Not yet. The ceremony marched on, the guards shifting positions in perfect time. The crowd moved slightly, following the action, but Thomas stayed rooted, his eyes fixed on David with a taunting gleam, ready to stir the pot again. The ceremonial watch neared its peak at Windsor Castle, drawing the crowd's focus toward the central courtyard. Tourists shuffled along the barriers, chasing better views of the marching guards. Thomas Reed pulled Ethan closer, his grip firm on the boy's arm. In the bustle, Ethan's small keychain, a tiny guard figure, slipped from his pocket, landing just beyond the barrier near Corporal David Lawson's feet. "My keychain!" Ethan cried, his voice breaking with panic. He yanked at Thomas's jacket. "Thomas, from Grandpa! Please get it!" Thomas groaned, his patience snapping. "Oh, quit whining, Ethan, it's junk!" But the boy's eyes welled up, his plea growing desperate. "No, it's special, please!" Thomas glared at David, his voice rising. "Hey, you! Pick up that thing! It's right there! Do something useful!" David stood motionless, his training locking him in place. The wind carried Ethan's soft sobs, and Thomas's demand hung in the air, unanswered, as the crowd's attention began to turn. Ethan's voice trembled as he tugged at Thomas Reed's sleeve, near Windsor Castle's north gate. "Tom, he's not supposed to move, right?" The boy's words were soft, uncertain, his eyes darting between his cousin and Corporal David Lawson. Thomas snorted, his irritation flaring. "Who cares, Ethan? He's useless anyway." He glanced around, noting the crowd thinning as they followed the ceremony. Then, with a sudden huff, he ducked under the barrier, stepping onto the restricted ground. His boots crunched against the stone as he strode toward David, his face twisted with defiance. Thomas stopped inches from David, his voice low and biting. "What kind of guard just stands there, too lazy to grab a kid's trinket?" He gestured to the keychain by David's feet, his tone thick with contempt. "Or maybe you're scared to bend down." David stayed silent, his body locked in position. Inside, a wave of frustration surged. The man's closeness, his disregard for the rules, his sharp words, all pressed against David's calm. Thomas loomed there, waiting, his breath visible in the cold air, daring David to break. Thomas Reed's frustration boiled over at Windsor Castle's north gate. He glared at Corporal David Lawson, his patience gone. Without warning, he swung his hand and smacked David across the face. The sharp clap rang out, cutting through the wind. The crowd nearby froze, their gasps swallowed by the chill. David didn't budge. His head stayed upright, his eyes fixed forward. He wouldn't strike back. His duty held him steady, even as the sting burned his cheek. Thomas stepped back, smirking, expecting a flinch that never came. Then something shifted in David. The weight of the day, the taunts, the coin, the slap, cracked his restraint. In one swift move, he grabbed Thomas's wrist, twisting it down. With his other hand, he raised his rifle high, his voice booming across the courtyard. "Stand back!" The command echoed off the castle walls, firm and clear. Thomas stumbled, caught off guard, his smirk vanishing. David's grip was iron, his calm replaced by a fire that had waited too long to flare. The air at Windsor Castle's north gate grew thick with shock after David's shout. A handful of tourists near the barrier stepped closer, their phones flashing as they captured the moment. Some whispered in surprise, others stood silent, unsure what to make of it. Corporal David Lawson held Thomas Reed's wrist, his rifle still raised, his voice lingering in the wind. Thomas's eyes widened, his confidence shaken. The small group watching clicked their cameras, the faint snaps mixing with the rustling leaves. Noticing the attention, Thomas yanked his arm free and dropped to his knees, his tone flipping to a loud plea. "Hey, easy! I didn't mean it, I tripped, that's all." His voice rose, shaky and exaggerated as he clutched his wrist. "I just wanted a photo, mate. Don't hurt me." The sudden shift drew murmurs from the onlookers, some buying his act, others squinting in doubt. David's focus wavered, the man's cries clashing with the fire still burning inside him. The scene teetered, caught between truth and theater, as the crowd's eyes stayed glued. Thomas Reed's loud pleas threw Corporal David Lawson off balance at Windsor Castle's north gate. The clicks of cameras faded as David lowered his rifle, the weight of his actions sinking in. His grip on Thomas's wrist slackened and he let go, stepping back with a sharp breath. Thomas scrambled to his feet, brushing off his knees, his voice still trembling. "See? All a mix-up. Help me out here," he called, waving at the onlookers. His eyes darted, playing up the stumble for sympathy. David's hand steadied, but doubt crept in. He'd reacted, crossed a line he'd vowed to hold. The small crowd shifted, some nodding at Thomas's excuse, others frowning in confusion. David straightened, his training kicking back in. He gestured toward the barrier with a firm hand, his voice low. "Move along, sir." Thomas hesitated, then shuffled forward, his bravado gone. David walked him to the edge of the restricted zone, keeping his pace even. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the stone. As Thomas stepped past the barrier, he shot David a quick, sly glance, then muttered something under his breath. It was too quiet to catch, but the intent stung. David stood firm, his face unreadable, watching Thomas blend back into the crowd. Ethan hovered nearby, his keychain still lying by David's feet. The boy's eyes flicked between his cousin and the guard, unsure what to do. David bent briefly, scooping up the tiny figure, and tossed it gently toward Ethan. The boy caught it, clutching it tight, his face a mix of relief and guilt. The tourists murmured, some drifting away, others lingering to watch. David resumed his post, the cold air biting harder now. Inside he wrestled with what had happened. His outburst, the man's trickery, the eyes judging him from every side. Corporal David Lawson stood tall at Windsor Castle's north gate, the wind swirling around him as Thomas rejoined Ethan beyond the barrier. The remaining tourists stared, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Some pointed, whispering about the guard who'd snapped. Others shook their heads, siding with Thomas's tale of a stumble. David felt their looks like weights pressing on his shoulders. His outburst lingered in the air, brief but enough to shift how they saw him. He kept his posture straight, hiding the churn inside. The keychain incident faded, but the moment clung to him. The murmurs grew as more heads turned, drawn by the sudden stir. A few voices rose, clashing over what they'd seen. "He grabbed that guy first," one woman insisted, clutching her scarf. A man nearby countered, "No, the tourists hit him. I saw it." The debate rippled outward, pulling stragglers from the ceremony's end. Captain Laura Bennett emerged again, her boots clicking on the stone as she crossed the courtyard. Her eyes scanned the chaos, then landed on David. She stopped beside him, her voice clipped. "Corporal, what's this mess?" David met her gaze, steady despite the knot in his chest. "A visitor got too close, ma'am. Handled it." Laura's frown deepened, unconvinced. She glanced at the crowd, then back at him. "Handled? You raised your rifle, Lawson. That's not protocol." Her words cut sharp, and David's throat tightened. He'd acted on instinct, not orders. Before he could explain, she raised a hand. "Enough. You're off duty. Head to my office now." She turned away, expecting him to follow. David gave a crisp nod, his heart sinking. The crowd hushed, watching him step away from his post. The wind carried the band's final notes as he left, the weight of their stares trailing him across the grounds. Corporal David Lawson followed Captain Laura Bennett into her small office inside Windsor Castle, the door clicking shut behind them. The room smelled of old wood and paperwork, a stark shift from the crisp air outside. Laura sat at her desk, her face tight with frustration. "Explain yourself, Lawson," she said, her voice firm. David stood straight, his hands clasped behind him. "A tourist slapped me, ma'am. I grabbed his wrist, told him to back off." His words were calm, but his pulse raced. He wanted her to see the full picture, the push that led to his pull. Laura leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "A slap doesn't justify raising your rifle, Corporal. You know the rules. Stay steady no matter what." She shook her head, cutting off his chance to reply. "I don't buy that it escalated that fast without cause. Save your story." David's jaw clenched, his defense stuck in his throat. Her tone left no room for debate. "I'm let down, Lawson," she added, her voice heavy. "You're better than this. Hand over your gear, you're off the roster until we sort this out." The command hit him hard, a punch to his pride. David nodded once, his movements slow as he unbuttoned his red tunic. The fabric felt heavier now, stripped of its honor. He set it on her desk, then placed his bearskin hat beside it, the rifle last. Each piece echoed years of sweat and dedication, now folded away. He changed into plain clothes, a gray jacket and trousers, feeling bare, exposed. Laura watched in silence, her expression unreadable. David turned to leave, the floor creaking under his steps. He pushed the door open and stepped into the hall, the castle's quiet swallowing him. Outside, he glanced back at the north gate, searching for Thomas and Ethan, but they'd vanished into the thinning crowd. The ceremony had ended, its rhythm lost to him. The ceremonial watch drew to a close at Windsor Castle, the band's final notes fading into the autumn wind. New guards took their places, their boots crisp against the stone, ready for the next shift. Corporal David Lawson sat on a low bench just beyond the castle walls, the chill seeping through his gray jacket. The day's events pressed on him. Thomas's slap, his own sharp reaction, the loss of his post. He stared at the ground, his hands resting on his knees. Everything had unraveled in under an hour, leaving him adrift, a stranger in the place he'd served for years. Tourists still milled about, their voices a distant buzz. The crowd had thinned, but a steady stream lingered, snapping photos of the castle's towers. David blended into them now, no longer the figure they'd watched. His thoughts churned. How had one moment flipped his world? He exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold. Then a small shadow fell across his boots. He looked up to see Ethan, the boy with the keychain, standing there. Ethan's hands twisted together, his face pale with worry. Sir?" His voice shook, barely above a whisper. David blinked, caught off guard. "What is it, lad?" he asked, his tone flat, still raw from the day. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing around. "Have you seen my cousin? He's got a green jacket, kinda loud. I lost him after everything." His eyes dropped, guilt flickering in them. David's gaze hardened for a moment, the memory of Thomas's taunts flashing back. He looked away, wrestling with the urge to walk off. But Ethan's voice cracked again. "Please, I don't know where to go. We're from out of town, and I'm scared." The plea hung there, tugging at David despite his bitterness. Corporal David Lawson sat on the bench outside Windsor Castle, staring at Ethan's pleading face. "Look elsewhere, kid," he said, his voice rough, edged with the day's sting. He turned his head, the thought of aiding Thomas's cousin souring his mood. Ethan's shoulders slumped, his keychain dangling from his fingers. "Please, sir, I've got no one else," he whispered, his eyes brimming with tears. "Tom's all I came with, and he's gone." The boy's fear pierced the air, raw and real. David's resolve wavered, his old sense of duty clashing with his hurt. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, lad. I'll help you find him." His tone softened, though a grumble lingered. "But don't expect me to like it. You and him caused this mess." Ethan nodded quickly, relief washing over him. They stood, starting down the path along the castle's edge. David kept his pace steady, scanning the thinning crowd. Ethan trailed close, his voice small. "I'm sorry about the coins. I didn't mean it to go so far." David glanced at him, seeing the boy's regret. "You didn't know," he said quietly, easing the sharpness in his chest. They walked on, the wind rustling through the trees. Ethan kicked a pebble, then looked up. "Why'd you become a guard?" His question hung there, simple but earnest. David paused, caught by the memory. "Wanted to stand for something solid," he answered, his voice low. "To keep history safe. Show I could do it." Ethan nodded, clutching his keychain tighter. "It looks tough, staying so still, especially with people like Tom." David gave a faint smile. "Takes practice, kid. More than you'd think." The boy's curiosity softened the moment, a thin thread of understanding tying them as they searched. Corporal David Lawson and Ethan walked along the winding path outside Windsor Castle, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. The boy's voice dropped as he spoke again. "I've been with Tom since my folks passed," Ethan said, staring at the ground. "Car accident last year. He's my only family now, but he doesn't really care." His fingers tightened around the keychain, his words heavy with a quiet ache. David's steps slowed, a pang hitting him. He hadn't expected that, and it stirred something deep, a flicker of pity for the kid caught in this mess. David kept his eyes ahead, searching the crowd for Thomas's green jacket. "That's rough, lad," he said, his voice gentler now. "But you don't have to copy him. You can choose better." Ethan nodded, his face serious, the keychain swinging in his grip. They passed a cluster of tourists snapping photos, the castle's walls looming behind them. David's mind turned inward. He thought of his own path, hard days, steady hands who'd shown him the way. In Ethan, he saw a boy teetering, pulled between a careless cousin and a chance to rise above. "You ever think about being a guard?" Ethan asked, glancing up with a spark of interest. David chuckled, the sound soft against the wind. "You'd need grit, kid. It's more than standing, it's holding firm when everything pushes you." Ethan's eyes widened, taking it in. "I could try," he said, almost to himself. David felt a warmth grow, a sense that this talk might plant something good. The day's sting lingered, but walking with Ethan shifted it, hinting at a purpose beyond the uniform he'd lost. The afternoon sun dipped lower as Corporal David Lawson and Ethan rounded a corner near Windsor Castle's west arch. A sharp voice cut through the air, jolting David's senses. He squinted ahead and saw Thomas Reed by a lone guard post, jabbing his selfie stick at another black guard, Corporal Miles Carter. "Smile for once, eh? Or are you all this dull?" Thomas barked, his laugh grating. Miles stood rigid, his eyes forward, weathering the taunts. David's blood surged, the echo of his own clash flaring anew. He couldn't let this slide, not again. "Stay here," David told Ethan, his tone firm. The boy nodded, gripping his keychain as David strode forward, his steps quick and sure. The wind carried Thomas's next jab. "What's with you lot? No life in you." A few tourists lingered nearby, watching the scene unfold. David closed the gap, his voice steady but loud. "That's enough, mate." Thomas spun around, his smirk twisting into a sneer. "You again? What's your problem?" David stood tall, his jacket flapping in the breeze. "You're my problem. You don't get to harass him too." Thomas squared his shoulders, defiance flashing in his eyes. "Mind your own business. This one's fair game." He waved at Miles, who hadn't moved an inch. David stepped closer, his words sharp. "He's doing his job, not your clown show. Back off or you'll answer for it." Ethan watched from a distance, his face tight with worry. The small crowd grew, heads turning, drawn by the rising tension. David's pulse hammered, but he held his ground, his earlier loss fueling his stand now. The tension thickened near Windsor Castle's west arch as Corporal David Lawson faced Thomas Reed. The small crowd edged closer, their whispers buzzing like flies. Thomas smirked, unfazed by David's words. "Big man now, huh? You're nothing without that hat," he shot back, jabbing his selfie stick toward David. Corporal Miles Carter remained still at his post, a silent figure in the storm. David's fists tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Keep talking. Doesn't change what you're doing." The wind howled, tugging at jackets and scarves, amplifying the standoff. Captain Laura Bennett pushed through the gathering onlookers, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She'd been heading back from a patrol when the noise pulled her over. Her uniform gleamed in the fading light as she stepped between David and Thomas. "What's this about, Lawson?" she demanded, her tone crisp. David straightened, meeting her gaze. "He's at it again, ma'am, bothering Carter now." Laura glanced at Thomas, then at Miles, her brow creasing. "You're off duty, Corporal. Why are you here stirring things?" Her question stung, but David stood firm. "Couldn't walk away, ma'am. It's not right." Thomas jumped in, his voice pitching high. "He's overreacting. I was just chatting with this guy." He pointed at Miles, playing innocent. Laura's eyes narrowed, weighing his act. Then Ethan darted forward, his small frame trembling as he spoke. "Tom's lying, sir." "Ma'am," he corrected, glancing at Laura. "Hit that other guard earlier by the north gate. I saw it." His words spilled out, shaky but clear, his keychain clutched tight. Thomas's face flushed, his smirk crumbling. "Shut it, Ethan," he snapped, but the boy held his ground, looking to David for strength. Captain Laura Bennett turned her steady gaze to Ethan near Windsor Castle's west arch, the crowd holding its breath. "Is that true, lad?" she asked, her voice softening just enough to coax him on. Ethan nodded fast, his hands twisting the keychain. "Yes, ma'am," Tom smacked him. "The other guard, over there." He pointed toward the north gate, his eyes darting to David for reassurance. "I threw a coin too, but I didn't mean it to get bad." His honesty trembled in the chilly air, his face flushed with shame. Corporal David Lawson gave a small nod, a flicker of pride lifting his chest. Laura's expression tightened as she faced Thomas Reed again. "Sounds like a pattern," she said, her words cold and pointed. Thomas sputtered, his hands flailing. "He's making it up. Kids exaggerate. You can't trust him." His voice cracked, desperation seeping through. The onlookers shifted, some murmuring doubt, others nodding at Ethan's words. Laura raised a hand, silencing Thomas's protest. She looked back at Ethan, her tone gentle. "You're sure about this?" Ethan swallowed hard, then nodded again. "I'm sure." "I'm sorry I didn't stop him." Thomas's temper snapped. He rounded on Ethan, his face red with fury. "You little snitch! Always ruining everything," he yelled, stepping toward the boy. "I should have ditched you back home, useless, just like your parents." The venom in his shout stunned the crowd, gasps rippling outward. Ethan flinched, his shoulders hunching as the words hit. David moved fast, placing himself between them, his voice firm. "Back off, Reed." His protective stance steadied Ethan, who clutched his keychain tighter, tears brimming in his eyes. Captain Laura Bennett's face darkened as Thomas Reed's cruel words echoed near Windsor Castle's west arch. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his outburst sinking in. She stepped forward, her voice icy. "That's more than enough from you." Her eyes flicked to Corporal David Lawson, then softened as they landed on Ethan, who trembled behind David's shoulder. "No one speaks to a child like that. Not here. Not ever." Thomas shrank back, his bravado dissolving under her glare. David kept his arms steady, shielding Ethan, a quiet strength rising in him despite the day's scars. Laura turned to David, her tone shifting to understanding. "Lawson, I misjudged you earlier. This changes things." David nodded, gratitude flashing through him. "Thank you, ma'am. I just stepped in when I had to." She gave a curt nod, then faced the crowd. "Anyone see what happened at the North Gate? Speak up, we need the facts." A few tourists raised their phones, others stepped closer, ready to share. The air buzzed with their movement, a shift toward clarity. Laura's call steadied the moment, pulling truth from the chaos. David glanced down at Ethan, the boy's tears streaking his face. He knelt, his voice low. "You're safe now, lad. What he said, it's not yours to carry." Ethan wiped his eyes, nodding weakly. David stood, facing Laura again, his resolve firm. "Ma'am, this boy's situation worries me. Thomas doesn't care. Left him alone out here, shouting that filth. Someone should check on him." Laura's brow furrowed, her agreement clear. "You're right, Corporal. That's neglect, plain and simple. It's beyond our scope, but I'll flag it for the right people." Her words carried weight, a promise of action hanging in the wind. Captain Laura Bennett wasted no time near Windsor Castle's west arch. She waved over a nearby constable, Officer Paul Grayson, who'd been patrolling the grounds. "Constable, we've got a problem," she said, her voice clipped and clear. "This man's harassed 2 guards and neglected his cousin here." She nodded toward Thomas Reed, who stood sullen, and Ethan still clinging to David's side. Paul stepped up, his notepad ready, his tone calm but firm. "I'll take it from here, Captain. Sir, we need to talk. Your behavior's crossed lines." Thomas muttered a weak protest. "It's nothing serious," but Paul ignored it, jotting down notes. Laura briefed Paul quickly. Thomas's slap, Ethan's coins, the outburst. Tourists handed over phone clips, their voices overlapping as they confirmed the tale. Paul's face hardened as he listened. "Right, Mr. Reed? You're coming with me for a statement and we'll need to look into the boy's care." He glanced at Ethan, then called a social worker from his radio. A woman in a brown coat arrived soon after, her smile kind as she approached Ethan. "Hey, I'm here to help you, okay?" she said, crouching to his level. David watched, a weight lifting. He'd done right by the kid. Ethan looked up at David, his voice small. "What's going to happen to me now?" His hands shook, the keychain dangling. David knelt again, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder. "You'll be looked after, lad. They'll find a safe spot for you." Ethan's eyes searched his. "Will I see you again, mister?" His hope flickered, fragile but real. David smiled, a rare warmth breaking through. "Maybe, kid. Keep that keychain. It'll remind you of today. You were brave out there." Ethan nodded, clutching it tighter, a faint spark lighting his face as the social worker led him away. Corporal David Lawson watched Ethan walk away with the social worker near Windsor Castle's west arch, the boy glancing back with a timid wave. The crowd had mostly scattered, leaving the grounds quieter now. David felt a mix of relief and ache. Thomas's fate was sealed and Ethan had a chance, but the day's toll lingered. He'd stood up, lost his post, and found something else in the mess. The wind eased, the sun dipping behind the castle's towers. Captain Laura Bennett stayed nearby, her gaze thoughtful as she watched the scene settle. Paul Grayson escorted Thomas off, the man's head low, his earlier fire snuffed out. The social worker reassured David with a nod. "We'll sort him out, don't worry," she said, before guiding Ethan toward a waiting van. Davy's chest tightened as the boy disappeared around the corner, his small figure shrinking in the distance. He'd helped, but it didn't erase the sting of his own fall. Laura approached, her boots soft on the stone. "You did well, Lawson," she said, her voice steady. "More than I gave you credit for." David met her eyes, surprised. "Just reacted, ma'am. Didn't plan it." Laura folded her arms, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That's the point. Instinct with backbone. I was too quick to pull you earlier." She paused, then straightened. "I'm putting you back on duty, Corporal. We need guards like you, ones who step up, not just stand there." David blinked, the offer catching him off guard. His post, his purpose. It wasn't gone. "Ma'am, he started, but she cut in. "Say yes, Lawson, you've earned it." He took a breath, then nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am, glad to be back." Laura clapped his shoulder, her grip solid. "Good, get your gear tomorrow. Rest tonight. You've shown what this job's really about." David felt a rush, the weight of the day shifting. He'd lost his footing, but now it was firm again, renewed. The castle loomed behind them, its walls steady as ever, a quiet witness to the turn of events. Corporal David Lawson walked back toward Windsor Castle's guard room with Captain Laura Bennett, the evening shadows stretching across the courtyard. The wind had calmed, leaving a crisp stillness in its wake. Laura led him inside, the heavy door creaking as they entered. "Your kit's still here," she said, pointing to a locker. David opened it, pulling out his red tunic and bearskin hat. He ran his fingers over the fabric, feeling its familiar weight. Stripping off his gray jacket, he suited up, the uniform settling on him like a second skin. His rifle rested against the wall. He grabbed it, the metal cool in his hands. Laura watched, her nod brief but approving. "Looks right again, Lawson. You're back where you belong." David adjusted his hat, a spark reigniting in him. The day had bent him, but he could stand tall in this. He followed her out, stepping into the fading light. She pointed to the north gate. "Take your post now. Show them you're still here." David marched over, his boots steady on the stone, and resumed his stance. The castle felt alive again, its history humming through him. He wasn't just a guard now. He was proof of something tougher. Tourists lingered near the walls, fewer than before, but their eyes found him. Across the path, David spotted Ethan standing with a new figure, a man in a dark coat, maybe a relative or a guardian. The boy's face lit up, spotting David in his uniform. He waved hard, his keychain glinting in the dim light. David kept his posture, but a small grin broke through, just for a moment. Ethan bounced on his toes, pointing at him, the excitement clear even from afar. The man beside him smiled too, giving a respectful nod. David's heart lifted. His stand had reached the kid, left a mark worth keeping. The evening deepened, and word of the day spread. A local reporter approached, her camera flashing as she spoke into a mic. "This is Corporal David Lawson," stood his ground and turned a rough moment into a lesson. David held his rifle firm, the attention strange but earned. Ethan's wave stuck with him, a quiet sign he'd done more than guard a gate. He'd shown a boy what standing up could mean. Corporal David Lawson stood at Windsor Castle's north gate, the night settling over the grounds. Ethan's wave lingered in his mind, the boy's grin a beacon in the dusk. The reporter lingered too, her camera crew packing up as she scribbled notes. Tourists drifted off, their chatter fading, but David felt their eyes differently now, less curious, more knowing. He gripped his rifle, the cold steel steadying him. Captain Laura Bennett had returned to her rounds, leaving him to hold the post alone. The castle's walls glowed faintly under the floodlights, a quiet strength matching his own. Word of David's stand rippled beyond the gates. By morning, a local paper ran a story. Guard turns taunt into triumph. Calls came in. Schools wanted him to visit, share his tale with kids. A letter arrived days later, scrawled in shaky handwriting. It was from Ethan. "Thanks for helping me," it read. "Tom's gone, and I'm with my uncle now. I want to be strong like you." David folded it carefully, tucking it into his locker. The words hit deep. His moment of fire had lit something in the boy, a path away from the mess Thomas had left. Back at the castle, David took his post each day, the routine familiar but changed. Visitors pointed him out, whispering his name. A teacher brought her class one afternoon, and David stepped forward during a break, his voice steady. "It's about holding on when it's hard," he told them, the kids wide-eyed. "That's what this means." He tapped his chest, the red tunic bright against the gray stone. A girl in pigtails grinned, saying, "You're cooler than the castle." Laughter broke out, and David smiled, the weight of it lightening. Weeks later, Ethan's uncle sent a photo, Ethan in a school play, dressed as a guard, keychain pinned to his costume. David pinned it to the guardroom wall, a quiet trophy. The slap from Thomas had faded, but what grew from it sharpened his days. He wasn't just guarding history now, he was shaping it, one small stand at a time. As he stood at the north gate, the wind whispering past, David knew his place. The uniform carried his strength, and the kid's trust carried his purpose, a steady beat beneath the castle's old stones.